Little girl solves $1 million lawsuit. Judge Cries, 6 months had passed since 9-year-old Sofia Martinez first discovered the abandoned law library in the basement of the Harrison County Superior Court building. What started as a hiding place from the chaos of her mother's cleaning duties had transformed into something far more extraordinary. A sanctuary where discarded legal briefs, old case files, and forgotten law books had become her unlikely teachers in the complex world of justice and legal procedure. Sofia's mother, Carmen Martinez, had worked as a night custodian at the courthouse for 3 years, arriving each evening at 6 p.m. to clean the offices, courtrooms, and corridors where the day's legal battles had been fought. Carmen had always brought Sofia with her during school holidays and summer breaks, unable to afford childcare and unwilling to leave her daughter alone in their small apartment in the low-income housing complex on the east side of town. While Carmen methodically cleaned the marble floors and polished the wooden benches where justice was supposedly served, Sofia had developed an insatiable curiosity about the legal documents that were routinely discarded in the trash bins of law offices and courtrooms: dismissed cases, outdated precedents, preliminary briefs that never made it to trial. All of this became Sofia's informal legal education. The basement law library had been abandoned for over a decade, its dusty shelves filled with legal treatises, case law compilations, and procedural manuals that digital databases had rendered obsolete. But for Sofia, these forgotten texts were treasure troves of knowledge about civil procedure, criminal law, constitutional rights, and the intricate mechanisms through which the American legal system operated. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country's flag in the comments, because today's story proves that sometimes the most important evidence is hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to find it. This is the story of March 15th, when Sofia Martinez walked into courtroom 7 and exposed the truth that would change everything. The morning began with unusual tension crackling through the corridors of the Harrison County Superior Court. The case of Rodriguez versus St. Mary's Hospital had captured the attention of the local legal community, not only because of the substantial $1 million damages being sought, but because it represented a classic David versus Goliath battle between a grieving family and one of the most powerful medical institutions in the state. The Rodriguez family was suing St. Mary's Hospital for medical malpractice following the death of Eduardo Rodriguez during what should have been a routine gallbladder removal surgery. Eduardo, a 42-year-old construction worker and father of 3 young children, had died on the operating table under circumstances that his family believed constituted clear negligence, but which the hospital's legal team maintained was simply an unfortunate result of unexpected complications that could not have been prevented. The case had been proceeding for 18 months, with the Rodriguez family represented by James Morrison, a dedicated but overworked public interest lawyer who typically handled immigration cases and had limited experience with complex medical malpractice litigation. Morrison was facing off against the formidable legal team from Blackstone, Pierce & Associates, the premier corporate law firm in the state, led by senior partner Victoria Blackstone, whose reputation for destroying plaintiffs in medical malpractice cases was legendary throughout the legal community. Sofia had been following the case with intense interest from her usual observation post in the public gallery of courtroom 7. She had read every public filing, studied every piece of evidence that had been submitted, and had even managed to obtain copies of discarded draft motions from the law firm's trash bins during her mother's evening cleaning rounds. What fascinated Sofia most about the Rodriguez case was not just the legal complexity, but the human tragedy at its center. Through her reading of the case files, she had come to understand that Eduardo Rodriguez had been the sole breadwinner for his family, working double shifts to support his wife Maria and their 3 children, Isabella, 8, Carlos, 6, and baby Eleanor, just 18 months old when her father died. The hospital's defense strategy was straightforward and, according to most legal observers, likely to succeed. They maintained that Eduardo Rodriguez had died from an extremely rare allergic reaction to anesthesia that occurred in less than 0.01% of surgical procedures and was therefore completely unforeseeable and unavoidable. Their expert witnesses had testified that the surgical team had followed all standard protocols and had responded appropriately to the emergency when it developed. James Morrison, despite his inexperience with medical cases, had fought valiantly for the Rodriguez family. He had retained his own medical expert, Dr. Patricia Chen, who argued that the surgical team's response to the anesthetic crisis had been inadequate and that faster intervention could have saved Eduardo's life. However, Morrison was struggling to prove his case because the hospital's documentation appeared to show that the surgical team had responded within acceptable time parameters. The case had been proceeding for 3 weeks, and by March 15th, most legal observers believed that Morrison was fighting a losing battle. The hospital's documentation was comprehensive and appeared to demonstrate that they had followed proper procedures. Their expert witnesses were more credible and experienced than Morrison's single expert, and most damaging of all, Morrison had been unable to identify any specific act of negligence that directly caused Eduardo Rodriguez's death. Sofia had been present in the courtroom for every day of testimony, taking careful notes in her composition notebook and comparing the witness statements to the documentary evidence she had studied. Unlike the attorneys, judges, and legal observers who were focused on the broad strokes of legal strategy and witness credibility, Sofia had been paying meticulous attention to small details and inconsistencies that seemed insignificant but troubled her methodical 9-year-old mind. The Honourable Judge Margaret Sullivan was presiding over the case, and her 30-year judicial career had given her a reputation for fairness, intelligence, and emotional composure that made her one of the most respected jurists in the state. Judge Sullivan had seen thousands of cases during her time on the bench, but the Rodriguez case had affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. The sight of Maria Rodriguez sitting in the gallery with her 3 young children, struggling to understand the complex legal proceedings that would determine their financial future, had touched something in Judge Sullivan's heart that years of judicial detachment had not completely hardened. On the morning of March 15th, Victoria Blackstone was preparing to deliver her closing argument for the defense, confident that she had successfully demolished the plaintiff's case through superior legal strategy and expert testimony. Blackstone was a formidable woman in her late 50s, whose silver hair and impeccable suits masked a ruthless legal mind that had never lost a medical malpractice case in over 2 decades of practice. Across the courtroom, James Morrison was reviewing his notes for his own closing argument, knowing that he was facing almost certain defeat, but determined to give the Rodriguez family the best representation he could provide. Morrison was a man of genuine integrity and compassion, but he lacked the resources and experience to compete effectively against Blackstone's high-powered legal machine. In the public gallery, Maria Rodriguez sat with her 3 children, her face marked by 18 months of grief and legal stress. She understood very little of the complex legal maneuvering that had dominated the trial, but she understood enough to know that her husband's death might go unpunished and that her family's financial security hung in the balance. Sofia observed all of this from her usual seat in the back corner of the gallery, her composition notebook filled with detailed observations about witness testimony, documentary evidence, and the subtle dynamics of courtroom strategy. She had been particularly intrigued by the testimony of Dr. Michael Foster, the lead surgeon who had been operating on Eduardo Rodriguez when he died. Dr. Foster had testified that he had been present throughout the entire surgical procedure and had personally supervised the anesthesiologist's response to the crisis that developed during the operation. His testimony had been confident and detailed, and he had effectively countered Dr. Chen's criticisms of the surgical team's emergency response protocols. But Sofia had noticed something that apparently no one else in the courtroom had caught. A small but significant inconsistency between Dr. Foster's testimony and the hospital's own internal documentation. During his testimony, Dr. Foster had stated unequivocally that he had been present in operating room 3 from 2:15 p.m. when the surgery began, until 4:47 p.m. when Eduardo Rodriguez was pronounced dead. He had testified that he had never left the operating room during the critical period and had personally directed the team's response to the anesthetic emergency. However, Sofia had noticed that according to the hospital's internal surgical schedule, which had been submitted as evidence, Dr. Foster had also been scheduled to perform a consultation in the cardiology department at 3:30 p.m. on the same day. When she cross-referenced this with the hospital's electronic keycard access logs, which tracked the movement of personnel throughout the building, she discovered that Dr. Foster's keycard had indeed been used to access the cardiology department at 3:28 p.m. and had not been used to re-enter operating room 3 until 4:02 p.m. This meant that Dr. Foster had been absent from the operating room for 34 critical minutes during Eduardo Rodriguez's surgery, exactly the time period when the anesthetic crisis had developed and when the surgical team's response had been most crucial. Sofia had spent hours reviewing the timeline using the discarded case files she had collected, and she was absolutely certain that her analysis was correct. The hospital's own electronic records proved that their lead surgeon had lied under oath about his presence during the most critical moments of Eduardo Rodriguez's surgery. As Victoria Blackstone rose to deliver her closing argument, confident in her impending victory, Sofia realized that she was the only person in the courtroom who knew the truth about what had really happened on the day Eduardo Rodriguez died. "Your Honor," Blackstone began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a case. "The evidence in this case is clear and unambiguous. St. Mary's Hospital followed all appropriate medical protocols. The surgical team responded quickly and appropriately to an unforeseeable medical emergency. The death of Mr. Rodriguez, while tragic, was not the result of negligence, but rather of an extremely rare allergic reaction that occurs in fewer than 1 in 10,000 surgical procedures." Sofia listened to Blackstone's polished argument, knowing that every word was technically accurate based on the testimony that had been presented, but fundamentally false because that testimony had been perjured. She looked at Maria Rodriguez and her 3 children, understanding that they were about to lose their case, not because justice had been served, but because the truth had been hidden. As Blackstone concluded her closing argument and returned to her seat, Judge Sullivan prepared to call James Morrison for the plaintiff's closing. But before she could speak, Sofia Martinez stood up in the public gallery. "Your Honor," Sofia said, her clear 9-year-old voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a knife, "I need to tell you something important about Dr. Foster's testimony." The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Sullivan, Victoria Blackstone, James Morrison, and every spectator turned to stare at the small girl who had just interrupted one of the most important trials of the year. "Excuse me," Judge Sullivan said, her voice carrying 3 decades of judicial authority and complete bewilderment. "Young lady, you cannot interrupt court proceedings. This is a formal legal proceeding, not—" "Dr. Foster lied when he said he was in the operating room the whole time," Sofia continued, her voice steady despite the intimidating attention of the entire courtroom. "He left the operating room at 3:28 p.m. and didn't come back until 4:02 p.m. The hospital's own computer records prove it." Victoria Blackstone shot to her feet, her face flushed with outrage. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. This child has no standing in this court and no knowledge of medical procedures or legal evidence." But James Morrison was staring at Sofia with growing amazement. He had noticed the girl attending every day of the trial, but he had assumed she was simply a curious child with nothing better to do. Now he realized that she had been paying closer attention to the case than anyone else in the courtroom. "What computer records?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with sudden hope. Sofia reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder thick with photocopied documents. "The key card access logs that were submitted as Exhibit 47, she said, walking toward the front of the courtroom. "Dr. Foster's key card shows he left operating room 3 at 3:28 p.m. to go to the cardiology department, and he didn't use his key card to get back into operating room 3 until 4:02 p.m. Judge Sullivan's eyes widened as she began to understand the implications of what Sofia was saying. "Bailiff, please escort the young lady to the witness stand. I want to examine these documents." Victoria Blackstone's confident composure cracked for the first time in her legal career. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We cannot allow court proceedings to be disrupted by a child who has no legal training and no understanding of—" "Ms. Blackstone," Judge Sullivan interrupted, her voice carrying a warning that every attorney in the courtroom recognized, "if this child has identified evidence that calls into question the truthfulness of sworn testimony in my courtroom, I intend to examine that evidence thoroughly." Sofia walked to the witness stand carrying her folder of documents, her small figure creating a surreal contrast against the formal majesty of the courtroom. She looked directly at Judge Sullivan without fear or intimidation. "Please state your name for the record," Judge Sullivan said gently. "Sofia Martinez. I'm 9 years old, and my mom cleans this building at night." A murmur rippled through the courtroom gallery. Several spectators exchanged glances of amazement and disbelief. "Sofia," Judge Sullivan continued, "you mentioned key card access logs. How did you obtain these documents?" "They were submitted as evidence," Sofia replied. "Exhibit 47. I copied them from the court file because I wanted to understand the timeline of what happened to Mr. Rodriguez." Judge Sullivan reviewed the exhibit list and confirmed that the key card access logs had indeed been submitted as evidence by the hospital's legal team. She then asked Sofia to explain her analysis of the timeline. Sofia opened her folder and pulled out a hand-drawn timeline that demonstrated the contradiction between Dr. Foster's testimony and the electronic records with the precision of an experienced legal analyst. Dr. Foster testified that he never left operating room 3 during the surgery, Sofia explained, her voice clear and confident. But his key card was used to enter the cardiology department at 3:28 p.m. for a consultation that was scheduled on the hospital's surgery schedule. The anesthesia crisis started at 3:35 p.m., according to the nursing notes, and Dr. Foster didn't return to operating room 3 until 4:02 p.m. James Morrison felt his heart racing as he realized that Sofia had identified the smoking gun that could win his case. "Your Honor, may I examine the witness?" Judge Sullivan nodded, her own pulse quickening as she began to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. "Sofia," Morrison said, "are you saying that Dr. Foster was not present during the medical emergency that killed Mr. Rodriguez?" "Yes," Sofia replied simply. "He was in the cardiology department doing a consultation while Mr. Rodriguez was dying. The other doctors in the operating room had to handle the emergency without the lead surgeon." Victoria Blackstone was frantically conferring with her associates, realizing that her entire defense strategy was collapsing. She had never thought to cross-reference Dr. Foster's testimony against the key card logs because no one had questioned his credibility. Judge Sullivan called for a 30-minute recess to allow both legal teams to examine Sofia's documentary analysis. During the recess, Morrison worked with Sofia to verify her timeline against all of the submitted evidence, while Blackstone's team desperately tried to find flaws in the 9-year-old's analysis. They found none. Sofia's analysis was methodical, accurate, and devastating to the hospital's defense. When court reconvened, Judge Sullivan called Dr. Foster back to the witness stand. The previously confident surgeon now looked pale and shaken as he realized that his perjury had been exposed by a child. "Dr. Foster," Judge Sullivan said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "I'm going to ask you one more time about your whereabouts during Mr. Rodriguez's surgery, and I want to remind you that you are under oath." Dr. Foster's hands trembled as he realized that his career and reputation hung in the balance. "Your Honor, I may have been mistaken about some of the timing." "Dr. Foster," Judge Sullivan interrupted, "did you or did you not leave Operating Room 3 during Mr. Rodriguez's surgery to attend a consultation in the cardiology department?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Maria Rodriguez gripped her children's hands, understanding that something important was happening, even if she couldn't follow all of the legal complexities. "Yes," Dr. Foster finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "I left briefly for a consultation, but I was only gone for a few minutes." According to the key card logs analyzed by Sofia Martinez, Judge Sullivan said, "You were absent from the operating room for 34 minutes during the medical crisis that resulted in Mr. Rodriguez's death. Is that correct?" Dr. Foster's career imploded in that moment. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Victoria Blackstone looked as though she had been physically struck. James Morrison struggled to contain his amazement and gratitude, but it was Judge Sullivan's reaction that would be remembered by everyone present that day. The veteran jurist, who had maintained professional composure through 30 years of difficult cases, felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized that a 9-year-old girl had uncovered the truth that the entire legal system had nearly failed to find. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Sullivan said, her voice thick with emotion, "I believe you may wish to make a motion." Morrison rose on shaking legs. "Your Honor, in light of this newly revealed evidence of perjury and the defendant's admission that their lead surgeon abandoned his patient during a medical emergency, the plaintiff moves for directed verdict in favor of the Rodriguez family." Victoria Blackstone attempted one last desperate objection, but her arguments were futile. The perjured testimony of her key witness had destroyed her case beyond repair. Judge Sullivan granted Morrison's motion, awarding the Rodriguez family the full $1 million in damages they had sought. But more importantly, she ensured that Dr. Foster would face criminal perjury charges and that the medical board would investigate his fitness to practice medicine. As the courtroom began to empty, Maria Rodriguez approached Sofia with tears streaming down her face. She knelt down to the 9-year-old's eye level and took her hands. "Mija," Maria said in broken English, "you gave my husband justice. You gave my children their father's honor back." Sofia felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened and the responsibility she had somehow carried. "I just read the papers carefully, Mrs. Rodriguez. Everyone should have seen what I saw." Judge Sullivan approached Sofia as the courtroom cleared, her judicial composure finally giving way to the emotion she had been suppressing. "Sofia," she said, kneeling down like Maria Rodriguez had done, "in 30 years on this bench, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You didn't just win a lawsuit, you exposed the truth and ensured that justice was served." Sofia nodded, overwhelmed by the praise from such an important figure. "How did you know to look at those records?" Judge Sullivan asked. "How did you see what experienced attorneys missed?" "I read all the evidence," Sofia replied, with the simplicity of stating an obvious fact. I made timelines for everything because I wanted to understand what really happened to Mr. Rodriguez. When I saw that Dr. Foster said he never left the room, but his keycard showed he did leave, I knew something was wrong. James Morrison joined the conversation, his face still showing amazement at what his unlikely ally had accomplished. "Sophia," he said, "you saved this family. Without your observation, they would have lost everything." Judge Sullivan stood up and addressed Morrison directly. "Mr. Morrison, I want to discuss with you the possibility of Sophia serving as a legal research assistant in cases where detailed document analysis might be beneficial." Morrison's eyes widened. "You mean officially?" "I mean that Sophia has demonstrated analytical skills that would be valuable in the legal profession," Judge Sullivan said. "Obviously, she would need proper supervision and guidance, but her attention to detail and ability to identify inconsistencies could prevent other miscarriages of justice." Sophia felt her heart racing with excitement. "Would I be able to help other families like the Rodriguez family?" "Yes," Judge Sullivan said with a warm smile. "You would help ensure that the truth is found and justice is served." That evening, as Carmen Martinez finished her cleaning duties and came to collect her daughter from the courthouse, she found Sophia surrounded by a group of attorneys and court officials who were treating her daughter not as an inconvenience, but as a legal professional whose contributions had changed lives. "Mija," Carmen said in Spanish, "what happened here today?" "Mama," Sophia replied, switching to English so the legal professionals could understand. "I helped prove that Mr. Rodriguez's doctor lied, and now his family will get the money they need to take care of his children." Carmen looked at Judge Sullivan and James Morrison with a mixture of overwhelming pride and protective maternal concern. "My daughter, she would be safe working with lawyers and judges." "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Sullivan said with complete sincerity, "your daughter may have the finest legal mind I've encountered in 3 decades of judicial service. We would be honored to help her develop her talents in an environment where she can continue to serve justice." As they walked home that evening, through the quiet streets of their modest neighborhood, Sophia carried herself with a new sense of purpose and belonging that was evident in every step. She was no longer just an invisible child hiding in courthouse corridors while her mother worked. She was becoming an integral part of the legal system itself. "Sophia," Carmen said as they reached their small apartment, "I'm so proud of you I don't have words. But tell me, how did you know that the doctor was lying?" Sophia thought carefully before answering. "Because I read everything, Mama. Not just the big important things that everyone talks about, but all the little details too. Sometimes the truth is hiding in the small things that people don't think are important." The next week, the Rodriguez family used their settlement money to purchase a modest home in a safe neighborhood where their children could attend good schools. Eduardo Rodriguez's death had been tragic and unnecessary, but Sofia's intervention had ensured that his family would be financially secure and that his memory would be honored rather than dismissed. In the legal community of Harrison County, the story of Sofia Martinez rapidly became legendary. The janitor's daughter, who had exposed perjury in a $1 million lawsuit and brought justice to a grieving family, was no longer invisible or ignored. She was becoming indispensable. In her composition notebook that evening, Sophia carefully wrote her latest entry. March 15th, Rodriguez versus St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Foster lied about being present during Eduardo Rodriguez's surgery. Keycard logs proved he was absent during medical emergency. Family awarded $1 million. Judge Sullivan and Mr. Morrison want me to help with other cases. For the first time, I feel like I can really help people find justice." She paused thoughtfully, then added, "Maybe I'm not just reading about the law anymore. Maybe I'm finally helping to make sure it works the way it's supposed to." The courthouse remained her second home, but now it felt more like a place of purpose than a place of hiding. Sofia Martinez was no longer just studying justice in discarded legal documents. She was actively serving it at the highest levels. And this was only the beginning of her remarkable journey in the pursuit of truth and justice. If Sofia's transformation from invisible observer to champion of justice has inspired you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Because Sofia Martinez is just getting started on her extraordinary journey through the American legal system. And the next case might be even more incredible than this one.